introducing Dr. Michael Yudell, who is currently at Drexel University, but making his way slowly but surely over to ASU. He is professor and incoming vice dean of the College of Health Solutions. He is an award-winning historian and ethicist of public health whose work focuses on the history and ethics of genomics, the history of the race concept, and the history of ethics and autism research. He received his PhD and MPH from a Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia, and his BA in History and Soviet and Eastern European Studies from Tufts. He conducts research on autism and ethics, including a National Science Foundation project examining the ethics of community-engaged autism research. So very important stuff. And he's currently writing A Way of Being Human, A History of Autism Spectrum Disorders. He chairs the Pennsylvania Secretary of Health's Newborn and Screening Follow-Up Technical Advisory Board. So just doing amazing work there, and we're so honored to have him to present on ethics to us. I know that's a big need for a lot of our members, so we're so grateful, and please take it away.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you for allowing me to chat with you all today. Really excited to be here. As you just heard, I am very slowly making my way to Phoenix, and will be on the ground full-time July 1st, which I am really excited about. Bringing my whole family cross country, and we are looking forward to the change and to the excitement of ASU and to the Phoenix area. So again, thanks. My job here today is to give an overview of both bioethics and public health ethics broadly, and then provide an example at the end from my autism research about the way in which autism can be relevant to MCH research and to MCH populations. So I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to share my screen. Hold on. The awkward transitions of this virtual world we live in. Okay. All right. Can you see that? I'm going to share it. I'm going to put it in full screen. All right, we good, Katie? You can see that good?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great. Okay, so why ethics? Well, there are lots of reasons to think about ethics and why we use them in public health and other fields of health. And one reason is that they're premised on moral foundations to help us think through right and wrong, good versus bad, and to give us principles that guide us through tough decisions in our work. We also think from an ethical perspective about the way in which concepts of health and disease are rooted in morals and values, and the way in which ethics can manage how we think about the morality of certain ways to treat health and disease, but also the way in which we conceptualize health and disease. And I can tell you from my own work in autism, autism has evolved as a condition over the last 80 years since it was first named as a diagnosis in the just before the middle of the 20th century. And there were significant judgments about the nature of the condition, those who had it, and the families of autistics that all relate to moral concerns, and it's a reason why we think about ethics in these contexts. Ethics can also promote the health of the public by seeing it as a moral goal and a moral good, and we're certainly living in a moment where that has come to the fore in a very dramatic, intense, and often very unfortunate and deadly way. There are ethical tensions in how we promote individual health. There are consent challenges in research and treatment. Once we have patients or research subjects enrolled, we want to protect them, and there are ethical tensions in that context. Also, more broadly, we want to think about the fair distribution of resources in a health context. Transplantation and organ allocation would be one example, but also in terms of, healthcare, who has access and who doesn't. And then, of course, in its most fundamental way, we want to do no harm in the context of health, public health, and health research. There are ethical tensions in promoting the health of the public. We've been living through them for the last, 16, 17 months. When we think about individual health versus the public's health, and an example of that would be the decision to wear a mask or not wear a mask, and how that may be an ethically charged subject for some, because it relates to the second point here, which can be the restriction of individual liberties to protect the population's well-being. And those are, of course, mask mandates. And I know there's some disputes going on right now in Arizona between several mayors and the governor. And this is an example of those tensions. So some more reasons why we need to think ethically in the context of health and healthcare and public health. Well, it provides a common and comprehensive moral framework for decision-making and research. It can unify disparate disciplines with an ethics to govern behavior in research and clinical practice. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in terms of how ethics really came to have a really significant presence in both clinical medicine, bench research, and also in public health. It offers decision-making frameworks for researchers and clinicians when we should do certain things and when we should avoid certain things. And it strives to offer protections to both individuals and populations. Before we get into some of the more granular examples of ethical concerns in health research, I want to, as a historian, I feel obligated to provide some context to why we think about ethics the way that we do, how we came to integrate ethical concerns into research, into medicine, and into public health, and some of the horrors of the 20th century that led us into this place. So, a series of research scandals led up to the creation of federal regulations governing the rights and welfare of human subjects in the early 1980s. Before the late 70s and early 80s, there were very few restrictions on how scientists and physicians conducted research. There were restrictions, and we'll go through a few of those as this talk progresses. But the types of structures that exist today, including the IRB, did not exist in its modern form until the 70s and early 80s, when it really became codified. There have been challenges and debates around the structure that we have, not whether we should regulate, but how to appropriately balance between protection and the advance of science. And there have been new issues that have come up in terms of the relationship between academia and industry, in international research, and in others, including the type of community research that we'll talk about later. And finally, related to all of this is the changing nature of scientific and medical authority. The doctor's word used to be the final word, and that has undergone a revolution over the last 40 to 50 years, and certainly the introduction of the types of technologies we're using today, or even something as simple as Google searches, have really changed how patients and physicians or research subjects and scientists interact. And there are also other cultural and infrastructure changes happening in terms of the primacy of the white coat of physicians, and how that has been challenged over the last several decades. But in terms of rooting modern bioethics, the story usually starts with the Nuremberg trials, which occurred from 1945 to 1947 in the wake of the horrors of World War II, particularly the Holocaust against European Jewry and other groups, including homosexuals, as they were deemed by the German regime, and other people who were believed to be either socially deviant or handicapped or disabled in some way. And awful things were done during World War II everything from the extreme of trying to exterminate the Jewish people to experimenting on prisoners of war and concentration camp victims. So after the war, a trial came about to try to address for quote unquote civilization, these issues, these awful examples of the horrors that humans can do on each other, and to try to create some type of regulatory structure, or at least a set of human or general values that could prevent horrors like this from happening again, which of course we know did not prevent horrors like this from happening again. And there are examples that we will not get in today in this talk. But the trial led to what is known as the Nuremberg Code. And again, there were no pre-existing international ethical or legal codes governing human experiments that could be applied during the trial of the Nazi doctors who were conducting these awful experiments that I mentioned. The Nazi defense argued that their experiments differed little from experiments conducted in the United States and elsewhere, and that no international law differentiated legal from illegal human experiments. And Dr. Leo Alexander, a medical advisor for the prosecution at Nuremberg, drafted 6 ethical principles governing human research subjects, which were subsequently expanded to 10, which is known now as the Nuremberg Code. So there's some key points. We're not going to go through all of them, but you may recognize some of these if you've done IRB review in your own research, or if you've read about these issues. First is that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. You do not want to engage in any type of research with somebody who has not willfully consented. Secondly, during the course of the experiment, the human subject should at least be at liberty to bring the experiment to an end if he or she has reached the physical or mental state where continuation of the experiment seems impossible. 3, the experiment should be so conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering. No experiment should be conducted where there is an a priori reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur, except perhaps in those experiments where the experimental physicians also serve as subjects. And 5th, the degree of risk to be taken should never exceed the determination by the humanitarian importance of the problem to be solved by the experiment. So you can see the seeds of what over the next 40 years would become modern bioethics. Now, you'll ask yourself, well, what happened to this code? And was it adopted in the United States? And not really. Why not? Well, for one, its legal status was unclear in the aftermath of World War II. So the United States and other countries didn't have to adopt the code. And there was a sense that the code was needed for quote unquote, those barbarians, those Nazis, and it didn't apply to researchers in the US. And of course, as we'll see in some examples later, at the time, including one very awful example, that being the Tuskegee study, at the time, the Public Health Service and other physicians and scientists were doing awful things here in the United States as well. You may argue that it wasn't as extreme as what the Nazis did, but I think that there are definite similarities in the way that certain studies were conducted here during the same time. So this is the second point is obviously not true. Next, there were institutional factors that might have prevented adoption, including a culture that saw physicians and scientists as the ultimate decision makers and arbiters of what was right and what was wrong. So some institutional factors include social norms being different at the time and science and medicine gaining prestige and authority. So scientists didn't feel like they needed to address ethical challenges because they were seen, particularly in the aftermath of the horrors of World War II, where science and medicine were ascendant and research was being funded at increasingly large levels, that they didn't need to pay attention to this. And in some sense, science is becoming divorced from ethics, and we see the beginnings of a publish or perish mentality. We also see the rise of the modern clinical trial at the time. The modern NIH is established in 1930, and the funding of clinical trials is increasing, and new methodologies are being used that focus on randomization, blinding, and placebo control, and those were thought to interfere with informed consent, which of course we know that they don't. There are some requirements beginning in the 1960s. The FDA starts to require pre-market demonstration of safety and efficacy, and that is sort of pushing these types of trials. And at the same time, institutional populations, including prisoners and orphans, are often used as study populations in clinical trials. By 1972, more than 90% of investigational new drugs were tested initially on prisoners. There are other examples in the 50s and early 1960s, which result in some limited regulations. There's deceptive research with juries, which lead to a law prohibiting recording of their deliberations, and the use of thalidomide as an antiemetic during pregnancy, which resulted in individuals you can see in this picture being born without limbs, led to the requirement for informed consent only for investigational new drugs. You start seeing pieces of consent get pieced together. There is another attempt at, sort of bringing some international consensus around ethics in research, and this was the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, authored by the World Medical Association. Again, it's not a law, but an influential code of ethics. Coming from a mainstream organization within the medical profession, some key points, many similar to the Nuremberg Code, distinguishes clinical research combined with patient care and non-therapeutic experimentation with different consent requirements. Clinical research with patient care is justified only by therapeutic value, and you obtain consent where consistent with patient psychology. And non-therapeutic research, consent required, though, with a provision for surrogate consent from a guardian, and research on captive and dependent populations, meaning prisoners and children, was not prohibited. The declaration was influenced by the pharmaceutical industry, which plays a role in the way some of these issues were shaped. A few other egregious studies from the 60s. From 1963 to 1964, at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital, live cancer cells are injected into elderly patients without their consent. It was not known at the time whether cancer cells injected into these individuals could cause cancer in them. So this was a particularly egregious example. They were not told what was happening to them. In 1963, it became, throughout the 1960s, these experiments at the Willowbrook State School in New York City, which was a study on the natural spread of hepatitis in a institutional setting with children, and then it was studied and treated to see what would happen and whether treatment was efficacious in such settings, and consent, true informed consent was not utilized. And then in 1966, Henry Beecher, who was the chair of anesthesiology at Harvard, a very prestigious physician, published a study with about 22 or 23 examples of egregious ethical violations from the medical literature by simply scanning the medical literature, reading through journals. He was considered a whistleblower, but he was protected because of the powerful position he was in. And it is continuing this process of attention, closer attention being paid to egregious ethical violations in human research. So we are still at a point where we are only seeing the beginning of federal government attention to these violations, but it's really not until the late 1960s and early 1970s with the unveiling of the Tuskegee syphilis study, which had been going on for 40 years, was funded by the U.S. government, was funded by the through the U.S. Public Health Service, that the need for ethical interventions became not just an issue within medicine, or even sort of a quiet political issue where issues around consent were discussed, but a national discussion. This was at the time of the height of the civil rights movement and other social movements that were challenging social and scientific authority. And the reveal of the Tuskegee study to the general public brought great shock and horror, although it is important to note that papers from the Tuskegee study were published in medical journals beginning in the 1930s and through the early 1970s. So this was not a study that was conducted in secret, and the study was thought to be okay, and it certainly wasn't for the reasons that I'm going to show you now. It's widely regarded as the most infamous biomedical research study in US history, a lesson in what not to do. From 1932 to 1972, the US Public Health Service ran a long-term study to assess the natural course of syphilis in Black men in Alabama. And it is an example of scientific racism because it was based on false beliefs about racial differences that shape both the study design, the mistreatment of the study subjects, and the study's conclusions. There were 600 African-American men who were used as subjects. None were told that they had syphilis, which was the disease under study. They were only told that they had bad blood. None were told of risks to loved ones, meaning if they were positive for syphilis, they were not told that the disease was dangerous to their sexual partners. None of the men were told that they were in a research study. They were lied to and told that they were receiving treatment, and they were all denied treatment, both salvarsan, which was a mercury-based treatment that was very risky but could be effective in treating syphilis, or penicillin, which was highly effective even after it became put into use in the 1940s. Other gross ethical violations: the Public Health Service made it difficult for participants to leave the study. The Public Health Service actively interfered with men receiving treatment at other locations. They administered lumbar punctures under the guise of special treatment. They enticed into the study individuals with free government health care and future coverage of burial expenses. These were largely very poor and illiterate men from rural Alabama. And they lacked proper care information, and 2/3 of the subject died by the end of the 40-year experiment. The media exposure of the study in 1972 led to the end of the study. The study propelled the ethics of experimentation into public view. And in response, Congress passed the 1974 Research Act to protect human subjects in research. It helped to establish a National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects in Biomedical and Behavioral Research, which was charged with establishing the boundary between research and routine practice, the role of risk-benefit analysis, guidelines for participation, and a definition of informed consent. This all led to the creation of what is known as the Belmont Report. And if you've been involved in IRBs, institutional review boards, in any way, you will know of the Belmont Report. So I'm just going to breeze through this because I kind of mentioned it, but just this third point, which is that the National Commission was comprised of prominent physicians, researchers, lawyers, philosophers, theologians. And it was different because before this happened, ethics in science and medicine was largely the domain of scientists and physicians themselves. And what happens is there's an expansion of individuals involved in what will become known as bioethics. So we move from a period of medical ethics into bioethics. So the Belmont Report, issued in 1979, has 3 core principles that really drive how we think about research today, whether it be clinical research or bench research or even population health research. And the first key point is the idea of respect for persons, that people should be treated as individuals able to determine what is best for them, and that people with diminished autonomy, such as the mentally ill, deserve special protection. Second, beneficence. A study should do no harm and maximize benefits and minimize possible harms. And third is the concept of justice as applied to research, which relates to the fair distribution of the benefits and burdens of research. This means, for example, the selection of research subjects needs to be scrutinized in order to determine, whether some classes, welfare patients, particular racial and ethnic groups, or persons confined to institutions are being systematically selected because of their easy availability, their compromised position, or their manipulability, rather than for reasons directly related to the problem being studied. So remember these are key concepts that function in ethics, on a daily basis, again, in terms of how we shape consent, how we shape the types of treatments people receive in research studies, the methodologies for those studies, what populations we can and should not or are not allowed to study, and so forth. So All of this is embedded in federal regulations for the protection of human subjects, 45 CFR 46, codified in the 70s, amended in the 80s to reflect the National Commission's guidelines from the Belmont Report. And it sets forth a basic set of protections for all human subjects, including relevant definitions, requirements for institutional review board review, its composition and functions, informed consent, risk-benefit analysis, subject selection, and documentation. It sets forth additional protections for pregnant women, fetuses, prisoners, and children. The FDA has its own version of the common rule that is almost identical to these other federal regulations. Which brings us briefly to the IRB. I want to describe the IRB for anybody who's done research. You are familiar with the IRB. It ensures that projects have scientific merit, that risks are minimized, that risks are being reasonable in light of anticipated benefit or importance of knowledge, that the selection of subjects in research is equitable, that informed consent is sought and appropriate, and that steps are taken to protect the subject's privacy. And finally, steps are taken to appropriately monitor collected data to protect patient safety in the case of clinical trials. Equitable subject selection is very important because it's motivated primarily by the principle of justice. We should not unduly burden some individuals or deprive them of due benefit. We want to also avoid exploitation, and we should be particularly cognizant of the special problems of research involving vulnerable populations such as children, prisoners, pregnant women, mentally disabled persons, or economically or educationally disadvantaged persons. A more recent emphasis has suggested that the Public Health Service grantees, meaning anybody funded by federal research dollars, must include women and minorities in a study so that research findings can be of benefit to all persons at risk of the disease, disorder, or condition under study, unless compelling justification for exclusion exists. And another emphasis, ensuring that medicines be formally approved for children if pediatric use is anticipated and would be beneficial. We're seeing that right now with COVID trials in kids. The first set of trials for the Pfizer vaccine have been completed in 12 to 16-year-olds. Moderna's doing a trial in infants through 12-year-olds right now, as will Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson. And these are all regulated by these rules. So I just want to briefly mention informed consent. There are 3 components to it. Participant has to be fully informed about the study, including purpose, benefits, and risks. The participant has to have cognitive capacity and legal standing to properly understand this information. And the participant has to make free choice to participate that is neither coerced nor unduly influenced. I'm going to skip this. These are just some finer points of consent. So what I did in the last 25 minutes is to provide sort of a general overview of both why bioethics is important, or why ethics is important, how bioethics came to be by looking at some of the awful history around human experimentation, and finally, what the United States and eventually other countries adopted in terms of frameworks to make sure that we don't replicate some of these horrors that we talked about earlier. So when we talk about bioethics, we're generally talking about ethical issues as they apply to individuals, an individual in a research study, an individual in a clinical trial. There are protections, of course, particularly how we think about justice and beneficence for the population, but there are concerns in public health that can be a little different, because sometimes there's a tension between what is good for the individual and what is good for the population when we talk about public health. And as I mentioned at the beginning, when we are looking back at the last year, we can see how this can come into play in some very damaging and dangerous ways. So I want to walk through some examples from public health for the next 10 minutes before I conclude with an example of my own from the maternal and child health research that I do in autism. So public health. When I give a longer version of this lecture, I talk about how in the late 1990s, there were discussions led by the physician and human rights advocate, Jonathan Mann, who tragically died in the late 90s, soon after he started some of this work, particularly around public health ethics, about how public health, particularly in the wake of the HIV pandemic, because at that point, really, 16, 17 years into the HIV pandemic, what public health was and what it should be in light of a global pandemic. And I think, as I'm talking through these points, they will ring true certainly today in the wake of the current pandemic and the way in which governments and individuals and politicians have reacted to what we've been living through. So Jonathan Mann thought about public health ethics in two ways. First, he thought about an ethos for public health, which he argued we needed to shape the field's core values, its goals, its boundaries, and its duties. After all, public health, or health as an approach to improving the population, is a disparate field, right? It's made up of sort of everything in the more narrow public health realm, from epidemiologists to toxicologists to ethicists, to community health scientists, to more broadly to nutritionists and community health workers, exercise scientists, and so on and so forth. And we could go on, because public health is such a all-encompassing field, and yet we have sort of no ethos that sews us together, other than we want to address population health and give people the best chance at being healthy. And Mann argued that this ethos is desperately needed to provide the field with purpose and intent, and a framework to motivate both the ideals and intellects of its practitioners. Mann advocated for a human rights framework to get at those challenges, to provide that ethos. And what I'm going to do is sort of walk through four frameworks that I think really can inform, or actually do inform, a health ethos and how we think about health in the context of ethics and doing right and being just with the populations that we want to see get healthier, and we want to reduce and eliminate disparities between populations. Anyway, so these are the four. Human rights was Mann's primary way to organize that ethos. And Mann and others believe that this framework was best suited to contribute, if not shape, the core values of public health. That modern human rights, as he wrote, is an effort to identify, promote, and protect the societal preconditions for human well-being. It's a starting point to focus our understanding on what needs to be protected. And human rights would create standards for the societal foundation of individual and collective well-being. The Foundation for Human Rights is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations in 1948. And the UDHR held that certain rights and freedoms should be held to a common standard, including the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Article 25 specifically names health as a right. A person has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and herself, of course, and his and her family. There are two ways to understand human rights. One is legalistic, that human rights is outlined and guaranteed by participation in international treaties or constitutional directives, or aspirational. Human rights is an ambition to which governments and people should strive. Now, the United States is not signatory to several legally binding international human rights treaties, nor are some of our legal precedents necessarily amenable to human rights interpretations, which presents some challenges. And critics suggest that the idea of human rights as applied to public health is too broadly defined, and that the individualistic focus of human rights can be inconsistent with public health's focus on collective well-being, which is why others have advocated for a social justice framework. And you can hear in a lot of public health and more general health rhetoric that we're going to approach health problems through a social justice and health and human rights framework. Social justice is concerned with disparities caused by health inequalities. And this approach dates back to 19th century France, where René Vierme, and in 19th century England, where Edwin Chadwick both approached problems of disparities that they recognized in their populations in very different ways. René Vierme very meticulously characterized disparities relating to working class and poor individuals in France, and could identify what we would call social determinants of health, although he didn't call them that, almost 200 years ago. But Villermé believed that those disparities or differences that he identified were simply the natural order and the work of God, so that nothing should be done to interfere in them. Chadwick saw things a little differently. He also identified at a very granular level social determinants of health as they related particularly to poverty and the built environment, although he wouldn't have called it that back then. And he believed that we could address such issues literally by cleaning up. And out of his ideas was born the sanitation movement, which literally worked to clean cities, which did have an impact on public health, but ultimately wasn't enough. And we know that sanitation is an important piece of redressing social inequalities in health, but not the most important one. Social determinants of health include socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, gender, and so forth, as you can see here. And a social justice framework seeks to control hazards to health and to create a system whereby the burdens of health are shared equally by all, except where unequal burdens result in increased protection of everyone's health. You can look to John Roberts, the Supreme Court Justice, decision in the ACA case back in 2011 or 12, I think it was ruled, where he argues that a tax may be an unequal burden, but it was a tax that was helping to protect everyone's health. And there's no universal agreement. One criticism is that there's no universal agreement on determining which inequalities and health outcomes are unjust, or a consensus on how to address these inequalities, which remains a problem that plagues us. We've been trying to address health disparities in this country with great effort, certainly over the last 40 or 50 years, yet disparities persist in many areas. Another framework is a communitarian framework, which is a community-based justification for public health interventions. And they're drawn from American political history to explore the intellectual precedents for a communitarian ethos. Democracy in the United States can sustain two complementary ideologies. One is a traditional liberal one, and I don't mean liberal in terms of, like MSNBC versus Fox News. I mean in terms of traditional liberalism, which emphasizes private interests and rights, versus a communitarian ethos, which emphasizes that individuals are members of a political community. This is an alternative to the dominant political discourse of the individual that relies on the harm principle or on paternalism, and instead protects the public's health as a community interest. It provides a foundation for encouraging citizens to share in reasonable and group schemes to promote a wider welfare, and one challenge is, does this approach protect those outside of the community interest? And finally, a juridical framework which sees government intervention as public health. And these are public health officials, like maybe some of you out there in the audience, who take appropriate measures pursuant to specific legal authority after balancing private rights and public interest to protect the health of the public. But it does reduce the field's practice to one that involves government action, coercive powers, and societal interests taking precedence over individual rights, which of course is a facet of public health, but isn't the only thing that public health is about. But it does frame it as reactionary and limited, and fails to acknowledge perhaps the breadth of the field. So there have been debates over the last 20 to 30 years about what ethics should be in public health. How do we translate that ethos, those four frameworks that I was just describing, into a code of ethics? The American Public Health Association did that in 2002, which establishes a code of acceptable behaviors and values for the fields. But it's written in an aspirational language of what public health practitioners should do, and doesn't provide the kind of specific ethical principles and legal underpinnings of public health practice that, let's say, the Belmont Report did for bioethics. I'm going to skip this and just look at two frameworks that are out there. James Childress and colleagues argue that there are 5 justificatory conditions to help determine when public health overrides liberty and justice. Effectiveness, you can read the definitions with me here. Will the intervention protect Public health, proportionality, will the benefits outweigh the infringed general moral considerations? Necessity, is there a supportable good faith belief that justifies a coercive approach? Least infringement, does the intervention seek to minimize the infringement of general moral considerations? Public justification, does the action explain and justify itself to affected parties? So that's one proposal. Another is from Baer and Fairchild, two ethicists, two different ethicists who argue that public health requires a population-based analysis and willingness to recognize that the ethics of collective health may require far more extensive limitations on privacy and on liberty. And certainly we have seen strains of that argument out there when it comes to masking over the last year, or vaccine requirements. We're starting to see those pop up as requirements for enrolling in universities for the fall, as one example. But public health works in simpler ways. We are required to wear seatbelts in cars. That is an example of the ethics of collective health and a restriction on individual liberty. And many states require motorcycle helmets as another example. So those are also examples on restrictions of individual liberty to protect both individual and public health. So I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time, and take a moment to transition to how all of what I've described, and I'm just going to close my door because my kids just got home and my dog's running around. The perils of Zoom home life. And talk about how all of what I've described in my own training has shaped my work in maternal and child health, particularly in the area of autism research. So just briefly, about almost 20 years ago, I published my first book, which was a collection of essays by myself and leading scientists and scholars from around the country on the Human Genome Project, and how genetics and genomics are shaping our world. I gave a public talk in New York City where I was in graduate school at the time. And afterwards, a group came up to me and said, hey, we really found the talk interesting, but what does the ethics of genomics and genomics research have to do with autism? Please tell us. And I said, I have to be honest, I have no idea. And they were like, well, they were from an autism advocacy group. And they're like, well, will you come and talk to us? We're a group of parents who are trying to learn more about autism in the 21st century, and what it means and where research is going. So like, give me 6 months. I went and did some research, and I discovered two things. One, this was at a time when autism research was really getting off the ground in terms of both intervention research and also other types of behavioral and brain research. But more interesting to me as an ethicist and historian was that there was about a 60-year history that preceded this discussion I had with them, where autism was named as a diagnosis in 1943. It didn't exist before then. And over the course of that 60-year history, some awful things had been done in the name of structuring that, that diagnosis, from the abuse of children and families, and the abuse of autistics, whether they be children, teens, or adults. So I decided to dig more deeply into this. I've been working on some other projects, but over the last decade or so, have been working on a series of projects relating to ethical and historical concerns in autism research. And what I discovered, and this is a project I did with my partner, Chloe Silverman, who's a social scientist with me here in Philadelphia at Drexel, was that there was little structured guidance for autism researchers seeking to design and conduct research in an ethically conscientious fashion. And this study was of particular concern to us because of the way in which the autism diagnosis has evolved. Back when it was originally named in the early 1940s, it was believed to be a hereditary condition. It evolved into a condition that, instead of being seen as an inborn trait, was believed to be caused by cold and emotionless moms who essentially caused their children to retreat into what was described in the literature as an emotionally frozen state. And the moms were named, you may have heard this before, refrigerator mothers. And it was believed that through intense psychotherapy, that the moms could be cured of their emotionlessness and that their children could be brought out of their autism. All of this, of course, rings as absurd today. It's filled with gender judgments of gender against women, particularly many of the women who were working in the 40s and 50s, whose kids were getting diagnosed first, and just awful senses of misogyny towards a whole generation of moms who were trying to do their best for their kids. And those ideas lingered really until the 1990s, and in some countries globally until very recently. We argue in our own work that these types of events have shaped how autism is thought of today. And we wanted to see, well, if we engage in communities, what are communities telling us? And the autism community broadly defined, be it autistics themselves, be it parents of both verbal and nonverbal children, and be it service providers, what they see as the priorities, both ethically and in research. So we began our study to try to understand this, and this just describes some of the challenges that I just mentioned. So our research questions are about what constitutes ethical autism research from the perspective of the communities affected by autism research, and what levels and types of community engagement are autism researchers doing right now in their own work. And we've spoken and surveyed autism researchers. And what individual researcher, lab, and institutional characteristics may be associated with high or low levels of community engagement. One of my graduate students is interviewing scientists right now to help understand this question. And how does this impact and show up in the published literature? So we've done a sequential mixed method study, and this is a little repetitive, so I'm going to skip this. And before we conducted the study, we had a community advisory board with diverse stakeholders, and we sought to find ways to engage participants as collaborators and sources of knowledge, and to consider what types of expertise are offered by communities beyond the results and studies, and could the project provide a means to support and cultivate research capacity in communities? These were some of our concerns. And then when we're all done later this year, we want to write up a sort of pilot framework for reporting results to participants and relevant communities. And this was one of the pieces of advice that we took from our stakeholder meeting. Because I'm running out of time, I just want to go through some of the preliminary findings that we found from the study that may be relevant to those of you who are doing either work in with autistics or a more broadly defined autistic communities, which would include families and other stakeholders, and how that might inform your own work. So what did we hear from the community? Well, participants expressed concerns about equitable research recruitment practices. Research participants tend to be college educated or connected to large autism research centers. And people argue that research participation should be more broadly distributed, so we can answer questions that may be able to address diverse communities in the context of autism. Researchers should be conscious of overrepresenting some groups in research, including children and parents, with relatively less attention given to adults or middle-aged people, non-speaking people, girls and women, or autistic seniors. And you can see the literature skews very heavily to looking at autism as a pediatric condition and to the way their parents think about the challenges faced by both their children and themselves. People also called for attention to ensuring an ethical recruitment process, and that participants are fully informed before consenting. I've had experience with my own IRB, where autistics were treated as a single group, and there was not an understanding that autism is a diverse condition. with very different ways of impacting individuals. And to continue, there were concerns about the ways that parent organizations and their funding may direct scientists towards cure-focused research rather than support and other types of behavioral research. And we can see this in the nature of funding in autism right now. It skews much more heavily towards prevention/cure and or normalization of autistics rather than support for autistics at, in all ways, because it's such a heterogeneous condition and at all points in their lives. And participants had many ideas about research collaboration, including specific topics and research questions, asking for more research about how to navigate daily life with autism, strategies for autistics with neurotypicals, which is everyone who's not autistic, ways to enable neurotypicals to better understand what living with autism is like, best practices for support and accommodations in day-to-day living, research on relationships, and research on associated medical conditions. Finally, many of our research participants called for the inclusion of autistics in research design. Inclusion can assume a range of forms. Scientists may work to educate themselves on autistic community perspectives, or autistic community members may participate via a range of processes, including advisory boards and community-based participatory research. And community members may be able to anticipate potential sources of harm that are not immediately visible to members of research team. And finally, talking about the benefits of community engagement as a means to increase diversity and participation in research, and ways to prioritize issues affecting the quality of life. So I will end there. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. I'm happy to stay on and chat for a while. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yudell. Okay, go ahead, Katie. You're muted.
Oh, Katie, you're muted.
I am on mute. You are right. Meg and I have been playing Quick Draw all day today. But yeah, thank you. That was really, really fascinating stuff that you shared. I see a question for you. I don't know if you can see the chat. Let's see. We hope you can connect with us in speech and hearing, sciences and communications, science and disorders, and CHS. Oh, they're just saying they want to connect with you. So that's from Victoria Clark. So
I'm happy to connect and looking forward to when I get there in July. If you want to reach out to me sooner, I have an ASU email that you can find in the directory, and don't hesitate.
Are there questions for Dr. Yudell? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Or if you're shy, put it in the chat. That's fine too.
And yes, I can share the slides.
Can you talk about how you plan on continuing this work a little bit more once you get here?
Yeah, so I have this project that I was just describing is wrapping up. Will be done in early fall, and we've got 3 papers that we're working on now, and we'll finish those up through the fall. I'm hoping to leverage this project into a second project on community engagement in autism research, and that's something that I would love to discuss with folks on the ground at ASU. I have a postdoc coming who will be joining me in September. She's finishing her PhD in Madison at the University of Wisconsin, and we will be writing together a book on the history of autism and the ethical implications of that history and current research. And then I have an ongoing project that is also coming to an end in Australia, where we did a series of oral histories with adults diagnosed with autism as adults. And we really wanted to understand the before and after of their lives. So what was their life like before they were diagnosed, and what was their life like after, in an attempt to understand autism over the life course better, and an attempt to think about what services undiagnosed individuals may need who may be captured by other diagnoses but may be autistic, or how do we make sure that adults who are aging and may be in need of services need those same services today. And I would like to do that project on the ground, perhaps in Arizona or perhaps in the Southwest, by recruiting individuals who are again, would qualify for that study. The final thing that I've been working on for years and have not had the time or funding to do is a project that would be an autism storytelling project that would allow individuals from the autism community writ large, whether they be autistics themselves, parents, any other stakeholder, to tell stories into an app that would be recorded and could be uploaded and shared globally. There's a lot of disparity globally between how autism is perceived and how it is treated. And this is rooted in a project that we did in Israel and Palestine, where we found that parents whose kids were diagnosed in the early 2000s in that region were looking for advice from parents in the United States who, where the rise of the diagnosis had happened about 10 or 15 years earlier. And we like to provide some of those resources globally as well through people telling their stories and sharing their journeys and experiences. So those are the projects. And of course, open to others. There's a question from Sarah Lavelle about resources or books. There's a book called Neurotribes by Steve Silverman, who is a journalist. It's a really interesting book on the history of autism. It's controversial in some ways. He's been accused of favoring what used to be called higher functioning autistics at the expense of individuals with more complex comorbidities relating to autism. But it's a really interesting overview. Temple Grandin's written some great books. I see her name coming up in the chat as well. My colleague Chloe Silverman wrote a book on the history of autism as it relates to alternative medicine. So if you Google on Amazon or go to Amazon, you'll find a slew of stuff. Or if you were to go to PubMed, you can find some shorter articles about the history of autism.
Looks like Raquel asked a question around in terms of the future of autism research, where do you think studies will go if there's a decreased focus on parenting styles?
Right now, autism research is all over the place, from genetic studies to brain structure to environmental exposure. But as I mentioned earlier, a lot of this research is focused on finding a cause and finding interventions to cure or decrease the symptoms of autism. But there is a push by many to move away from conceiving of autism as a disease or disorder and thinking of it more as a condition. And again, this can be controversial, especially for parents with kids who either don't have language or have more severe comorbidities relating to autism. So, I think what is important is to think about how to strike a balance between, these diverse, populations within the autism community. And I think that's a challenge. But I think part of the challenge is to think about how we conceptualize of an autistic life. And when we are thinking about prevention or, cure, are we devaluing, and this is where, ethics can come in and be useful, are we devaluing people across the autism spectrum if we want to prevent or cure what is autism? So bigger questions, we're not going to answer them today, but things you can read about in the literature. And I don't know if we have time for a couple more questions or one more question.
I have a question, and it may not be answered. I was thinking about, as you were going over the Tuskegee experiment, and Blacks today, a lot of reasons why some of them don't want to get the vaccine is because of the Tuskegee experiment. Was there any type of repercussion because of what was done to the people that were involved in this experiment? Were there any lawsuits? Were there any thing given to the families who had to suffer through this? I don't know if you know or not.
So yeah, so during the Clinton administration in the 1990s, there was an official government apology to the survivors. I believe there was some compensation either associated with that or some earlier non-apology level uh, approaches. But I will add that it's not just Tuskegee, particularly in the context of distrust in the Black community or other communities of color. Medical and scientific racism are real things. They have not gone away. Tuskegee is such an egregious example that many people know about it, but barriers to care remain in many places, if not across our nation. And the way COVID has played out is another example of the way in which racism as a structural determinant of health has caused certain communities to suffer, more than others. And we saw that, early in the pandemic on the East Coast, especially where Black communities were suffering disproportionately. And later we saw it on the West Coast and in the Southwest, where Latino communities were suffering disproportionately. And it generally related not to skin color, but to socioeconomic status, but that can also relate to skin color in certain parts of the country and in certain communities. And that, to me, in the way in which racism still shapes medicine, is another big piece of why there is lasting distrust. Certainly Tuskegee is a huge part of it, but it continues to today. And I will say that there have been some interesting studies and statistics showing that originally it was like, oh, Black people aren't going to take the COVID vaccine because of distrust. And yes, some people will not take the vaccine because of issues of distrust, but Black people are getting vaccinated at higher rates than some white populations. So I think it's a access issue still, and I've seen it in my own home here in Philadelphia, where vaccinations were given out in certain communities that were more easily accessible to certain populations, and not in other communities, which again created some of the earlier disparities in vaccine uptake. So it's a challenging and difficult terrain. But thank you for your question, and I think it's a great point.
No, thank you.